A wealthy man boarded a private jet with his new girlfriend, ready for a romantic weekend getaway. When he finally saw who was piloting the aircraft, his blood ran cold with shock and a dawning sense of dread. It was his ex-girlfriend, the one he had callously abandoned without a word of explanation years ago. What happens next reveals a buried past, a secret life he desperately tried to leave behind. 3 minutes to takeoff, sir. The flight attendant announced crisply as Michael Dawson watched a technician make the final adjustments to the jet's powerful engine through the small oval window. Just then, his cell phone vibrated urgently with an anonymous text message. "She's in the cockpit, and so is your son." The successful businessman choked on a sip of his expensive champagne, feeling the burning liquid sear his throat. "Impossible," he muttered under his breath, his eyes darting over to Isabel, who was casually touching up her perfect lipstick, seemingly oblivious to the emotional earthquake those 7 short words had just unleashed within him. Ignoring the flight crew's immediate protests, Michael stood up abruptly on an uncontrollable impulse and bolted down the luxurious corridor. He pushed the heavy cockpit door open with unnecessary force, only to freeze, completely paralyzed by the life-altering sight that greeted him. Julia, the woman he had heartlessly abandoned 5 long years ago, was confidently commanding the aircraft's controls with the same unwavering precision and grace with which she had once effortlessly touched his heart. And standing right next to her, wearing an adorable miniature pilot's uniform, was a small boy who was, without a doubt, his perfect miniature reflection. Time seemed to stop completely in that surreal instant. The deafening roar of the jet engines, the constant electronic signals emanating from the sophisticated control panel, everything faded into the background, replaced by the deafening silence of that impossible, life-altering encounter. Michael felt the blood turn to ice water in his veins as his brain struggled desperately to process the utterly unbelievable scene unfolding before him. "Sir, I must ask you to return to your seat immediately. We are in the process of taking off," Julia stated calmly and professionally, although her emerald green eyes betrayed a raging storm of conflicting emotions. Not even a slight tremor in her voice hinted at the emotional hurricane that was surely tearing her apart inside. The little boy turned around in his seat, his face full of childish curiosity. His big, bright brown eyes, which were undeniably the exact same color as Michael's, sparkled with innocence and youthful enthusiasm. "Hello, I'm Leo. Do you like airplanes?" He held up a meticulously detailed miniature model of an aircraft. "This one is my favorite." For the first time in his successful life, Michael Dawson, the powerful real estate magnate who was known for his unmatched eloquence in any business or social situation, found himself completely speechless, utterly and completely at a loss for words. "Sir," a flight attendant, whose name tag read Carla, appeared anxiously behind him. "I must insist that you immediately return to your assigned seat for takeoff." "Of course," he murmured almost mechanically, his gaze still completely fixed on the young boy who was smiling innocently back at him. "Of course." Stumbling numbly back down the narrow corridor, Michael returned to his plush seat, his body moving on autopilot while his mind spun wildly in a vortex of confusion and disbelief. Those eyes, that strong chin, even the subtle way he tilted his head slightly to the side. There was absolutely no possible doubt in his mind. "Honey, what happened? You're as pale as if you've seen a ghost," Isabel asked, touching his arm lightly, her genuine concern evident on her perfectly sculpted face. A ghost, Michael thought. Yes, that's exactly what it was. It was the ghost of his past, the painful specter of decisions he had made with the calculated coldness that had always guided every aspect of his carefully constructed life. It was the ghost of a failed relationship that he had coldly decided to end with nothing more than a brief, impersonal note, without ever looking back, without considering any of the possible consequences beyond his own immediate emotional comfort and convenience. "It's nothing," he lied in a strangely hoarse voice, desperately trying to regain control. "Just a slight case of vertigo, that's all." The aircraft's communication system emitted a soft, familiar noise before Julia's calm, controlled voice filled the luxurious cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard." Our flight to Fernando de Noronha is expected to take approximately 2 hours and 40 minutes. The weather conditions are perfect for flying, with a clear sky forecast throughout our entire route. Please keep your seat belts fastened during takeoff. Relax and enjoy your flight. Michael closed his eyes tightly, every single word she spoke piercing him like 1,000 tiny needles. Captain. Of course she had become a pilot. Julia had always been remarkably brilliant, fiercely determined, and more than capable of conquering anything she set her intelligent mind to. A talented aerospace engineer who possessed an incredible passion for aviation, even when he had condescendingly dismissed it as just a simple hobby. The jet accelerated rapidly down the runway, pressing him firmly against his comfortable seat. As the aircraft gracefully gained altitude, Michael felt his perfectly controlled world plummeting violently into a terrifying freefall. Who sent that message? The urgent question formed in his racing mind, causing him to frantically check his cell phone once again. Unknown number, no identification. How could anyone possibly know? How could anyone have accurately predicted this completely impossible encounter? Let's toast to our romantic weekend, Isabel suggested brightly, having already recovered from her momentary concern. She poured 2 glasses of the expensive Dom Perignon champagne that the attentive flight attendant had just brought over. Michael nodded almost mechanically, his gaze still lost in the infinite void of his terrifying thoughts, while his trembling fingers instinctively touched the small velvet box in the inside pocket of his expensive jacket. It contained the sparkling engagement ring he had intended to use to seal a future that, in the course of the last 5 minutes, had become agonizingly uncertain. To us, she said, raising her glass high, her beautiful eyes shining with joyful anticipation. At 28 years old, Isabel represented everything he valued most in a woman. Radiant beauty, intoxicating youth, a complete absence of any unnecessary emotional complications, and an almost reverential admiration for his powerful position and wealth. To us, he responded automatically, the bubbly liquid going down his throat completely without taste or sensation. For the next agonizing hour, Michael pretended to work diligently on his tablet. Numbers and graphs danced senselessly before his unfocused eyes, while his mind frantically reconstructed fragmented memories of his distant past. He vividly remembered his last night with Julia, their intense discussion about long-term commitment, about building something real and lasting together. He painfully remembered his own overwhelming silent panic at the daunting prospect of emotional vulnerability and intimacy, the cold, calculated decision to abruptly cut all ties with her, to simply disappear from her life without a trace. We are encountering some light turbulence. Julia's familiar voice sounded once again on the aircraft's communication system. Please keep your seatbelts securely fastened until the seatbelt sign is turned off. The aircraft shook slightly, perfectly mirroring Michael's inner turmoil. Isabel nervously grabbed his arm, her deep-seated fear of flying suddenly visible on her flawlessly made-up face. Is everything okay? He mechanically reassured her, the empty words sounding hollow and meaningless, even to his own ears. Nothing was okay, and he seriously doubted that anything would ever be okay again. Mr. Dawson. The flight attendant approached him discreetly after a few long minutes. The captain requests your presence in the cockpit if possible. Michael felt his stomach drop to the floor. Isabel raised her perfectly sculpted eyebrows, clearly intrigued and suspicious. Since when do pilots casually invite passengers to the cockpit during flights? It must be about our estimated time of arrival, he improvised quickly, unfastening his seat belt. I'll be back in just a minute. Every single step he took toward the cockpit seemed to last an eternity. The private jet's luxurious corridor, which had always represented his unparalleled success and power, now seemed like a narrow, suffocating tunnel leading him inexorably toward an unavoidable confrontation with the painful consequences of his past choices. Upon entering the cockpit, he found only young Leo still happily playing with his toy airplane. The little boy smiled brightly when he saw him standing there. Mommy said to wait here because she needed to check something in the back. Do you want to see my entire airplane collection? The boy opened a small, colorful backpack, revealing a collection of meticulously organized miniature airplanes. Michael sat down slowly and heavily in the co-pilot's seat, watching the small child, his son, with a complex mixture of intense fascination and utter terror. How was it even possible that this small, innocent being existed in the world without him ever knowing? How was it possible that something so incredibly significant could occur in a world that he had always believed he completely controlled? "This one is my favorite," Leo continued cheerfully, completely oblivious to the man's emotional turmoil beside him. "It's a Boeing 787 Dreamliner. Mommy said that one day we'll pilot a real one together." "Your mom? Is she a good pilot?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The best in the entire world." The young boy's unwavering enthusiasm was contagious. "She knows absolutely everything about airplanes, and she also teaches me math and physics. I'm going to be a pilot just like her when I grow up." The cockpit door opened and Julia returned, her eyes meeting Michael's for a fleeting moment before returning immediately to the control panel instruments. "Leo, honey, Carla will take you to see the rest of the plane now." "Okay. I need to talk to Mr. Dawson." The boy nodded animatedly, carefully collecting his model airplanes before following the flight attendant out of the cockpit. When the door closed securely behind them, the silence in the small cockpit became almost physically tangible. "He doesn't know," Julia finally spoke, her eyes fixed firmly on the control panel. "As far as he's concerned, his dad is a pilot who works on long international routes and can't be around." "Why didn't you tell me?" Michael questioned, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "Tell you?" She finally turned to face him, years of pent-up pain and resentment burning brightly in her emerald-green eyes. "Tell you? Tell the man who simply disappeared without a trace, leaving only a cold note behind? The man who immediately blocked my phone number and instructed his employees to tell me that he had moved to another country." Michael had absolutely no answer to give her. For the first time in his life, he truly saw the profound magnitude of his callous actions through someone else's hurt eyes. "I found out I was pregnant 3 weeks after you left," she continued, her voice remaining controlled and almost unnaturally professional. "And I decided that my son deserved so much more than a father who clearly didn't want to be found." The aircraft shook again with more unexpected turbulence, perfectly mirroring Michael's intense internal agitation. "And this meeting is just a coincidence?" A faint, almost imperceptible smile appeared briefly on Julia's lips. "Do you actually believe in coincidences, Michael? In a world with thousands of pilots and hundreds of different executive aviation companies?" Before he could respond, the control panel emitted a piercing alert, immediately demanding Julia's undivided attention. "Please return to your seat, Mr. Dawson. We have a technical problem that I need to take care of immediately." "And what kind of problem is it?" Concern was now clearly evident in his shaken voice. "Nothing your precious model girlfriend needs to worry her pretty little head about," Julia replied sharply, the first genuine sign of emotion cracking through her perfectly controlled demeanor. "Just a secondary hydraulic system failure. We'll have to make an unscheduled landing for a thorough checkup." Michael stood up, stunned. "Where?" "Case Moreau de Abreu," she replied, adjusting some controls on the panel. "A small town in the interior of Rio de Janeiro state. It has a decent runway and excellent mechanics." Upon mentioning the name of the small town, her eyes briefly met his once again, and Michael finally understood the full scope of what was happening. It wasn't just any random city with a conveniently located runway. It was where Julia was living, where his son was growing up completely without him. "This isn't a coincidence, is it?" he murmured softly, understanding fully dawning on him. Julia's expression was completely unreadable as she responded. "Life rarely gives us second chances, Michael. What we ultimately choose to do with them is entirely up to us." As he returned slowly to his plush seat, feeling the luxurious plane begin a gentle descent, Michael reread the mysterious text message on his phone. "She's in the cockpit, and so is your son." Who could have known? Who was orchestrating this completely impossible encounter? He glanced over at Isabel, who was distractedly flipping through the glossy pages of a fashion magazine, completely oblivious to the emotional earthquake that was rapidly redefining the entire landscape of his carefully constructed life. The small velvet box containing the engagement ring in his pocket now seemed to weigh 1,000 tons as the jet rapidly descended toward a small town that he intuitively sensed would irrevocably change his carefully planned destiny forever. "Any problem?" Isabel asked, noticing his noticeably disturbed expression. "Just a change of plans," he replied, his voice strangely calm considering the internal chaos that was raging within him. "We'll need to make a quick technical stop before heading on to the resort." The fasten seatbelt sign lit up brightly, and Julia's familiar voice, sounding professional and completely controlled, filled the cabin one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will shortly begin our descent procedure for the regional airport of Casemiro de Abreu. Due to some minor technical reasons, we will be making an unscheduled stop. We ask that you remain in your seats with your seat belts securely fastened. Thank you for your understanding." Michael Dawson, the man who had meticulously built a vast real estate empire, carefully planning every single move with millimeter precision, a man who never willingly left anything to chance, now found himself completely adrift, descending rapidly toward a future that he could neither predict nor control. For the very first time in his privileged life, the man who always had all the answers was completely speechless before the most important and terrifying question he had ever faced: how to be a real father to a son he didn't even know existed. The small Casemiro de Abreu airport was little more than a simple concrete runway with a modest airplane hangar and a makeshift waiting room. When the jet stairs were finally positioned and the door was opened, Michael felt the thick, humid heat of the Rio de Janeiro interior envelop him immediately like a dark premonition. The relentless midday sun reflected harshly off the hot asphalt, creating shimmering waves of heat that distorted the rolling, mountainous landscape in the distance. "Welcome to Casemiro de Abreu," Julia announced to the group, her professional voice contrasting sharply with the intensity of her gaze when it briefly met Michael's across the cabin. "Unfortunately, we'll need a few hours for maintenance. The problem with the secondary hydraulic system requires some specialized parts that are currently being brought in from Rio. I highly recommend that you take this unexpected opportunity to see the town or relax at the local hotel." "Local hotel?" Isabel couldn't hide the obvious horror in her voice, her eyes scanning the rural landscape with undisguised discomfort. "What kind of place is this, anyway?" Michael watched young Leo skip excitedly down the stairs, the child's boundless energy in stark contrast with the palpable tension that was building between the adults. The little boy held Julia's hand tightly, looking at everything around him with the insatiable curiosity typical of a normal 5-year-old. "Mommy, can we go see the airplanes in the hangar before we go home?" the little one asked, pulling lightly on her crisp uniform sleeve. "Home?" The simple word echoed loudly in Michael's confused mind. This humble place was their home. His son had grown up here, completely without him, building precious memories that he would never be a part of. "We have guests today, honey," Julia replied gently, stroking the boy's soft hair. "We need to be good hosts. Mr. Dawson and the lady are coming to our house?" The unbridled enthusiasm in the young boy's voice made Michael's heart ache with a deep regret. "Can I show them my entire collection of airplanes?" Before Julia could even respond, an elderly man approached them slowly, walking with the aid of a beautifully carved cane. His shrewd eyes carefully examined the group for a moment before he broke into a surprisingly warm and welcoming smile. "Grandpa Carlos." Leo ran to the old man, who lifted him up easily with surprising strength for his apparent age. "These are our passengers," Julia explained calmly, maintaining her professional composure. "Mr. Michael Dawson and Ms. Isabel Montero. We're having a slight technical problem with the jet, so we'll need to stay here until tomorrow." The old man, Carlos, fixed his piercing gaze directly on Michael with a disconcerting intensity, as if he could see far beyond the businessman's polished facade, directly into his troubled soul. "Dawson," he repeated slowly, "the famous real estate businessman. What an interesting coincidence." Yet there was nothing at all casual in his tone of voice, and Michael immediately realized that the old man knew exactly who he was and what he represented in Julia and Leo's lives. "Well, we certainly can't leave our unexpected visitors without proper accommodations," Carlos continued smoothly. Our guest house is completely at your disposal, although it certainly isn't as luxurious as the five-star hotels you must be accustomed to. Guest house? Isabel whispered to Michael, her growing displeasure clearly evident. I appreciate the kind offer, Michael replied carefully, feeling strangely vulnerable and exposed under the old man's penetrating gaze. But we really don't want to bother you. There must be a decent hotel somewhere in town. The only hotel in town is currently undergoing extensive renovations, Carlos replied, smiling thinly, a distinct sparkle of amusement dancing in his knowing eyes. Our small guest house is quite comfortable, and it's conveniently located close to the mechanic's workshop, which will make things much easier when the necessary parts arrive. Michael realized that he was caught in a subtly constructed trap. There were absolutely no coincidences here, from the carefully orchestrated technical failure to the only available accommodation option. Grandpa makes the very best breakfast in the entire world, Leo exclaimed excitedly, hanging affectionately on the old man's neck. And there's a beautiful lake where we can go see all the turtles. It seems we really don't have much of a choice, Michael conceded, trying his best to ignore Isabel's furious glare. 20 minutes later, an old, beat-up station wagon parked in front of a charming colonial house that had been lovingly converted into a small guest house. Well-kept gardens framed the centuries-old building beautifully, and the intoxicating scent of fragrant jasmine filled the warm air. In the distance, a serene lake reflected the bright blue sky, and verdant mountains completed the picturesque, bucolic landscape. Welcome to the Blue Horizon Guest House, Carlos announced proudly, leading them across the polished wooden porch. We only have 5 suites available, but all of them have a spectacular view of either the lake or the surrounding mountains. The interior was a harmonious combination of beautifully preserved antiques and discreetly integrated modern comforts. Black and white photographs tastefully decorated the walls, telling the rich history of the region and the family. It's charming, Isabel commented politely, clearly disappointed, but trying hard to be cordial. Leo tugged playfully on Michael's hand, catching him completely by surprise. Come see my room. It has an entire wall of airplanes. And Michael shot a questioning look at Julia, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible authorizing nod, silently allowing him to follow the young boy. The narrow corridor they walked down was decorated with more old photographs, many of them showing a much younger Julia, some with an elderly man in a pilot's uniform, whom Michael presumed was Julia's grandfather. Leo's room was a miniature aviation dream come true. An entire wall had been transformed into a vivid sky with hand-painted clouds, and dozens of painstakingly detailed model airplanes hung suspended at different altitudes. A custom-built, cockpit-shaped bed dominated the center of the room, and shelves displayed a colorful collection of children's books about aviation, many written in both English and Spanish. This is me when I grow up. Leo pointed excitedly to a large poster of a handsome pilot standing proudly in front of a massive Boeing 787. I'm going to fly all over the world, just like my dad. Michael felt his heart skip a painful beat. Your dad? He's an international pilot, Leo responded with innocent pride. Mommy says he flies so far away and for so long that he can't visit us very often. But one day, when I'm a pilot too, I'll find him up there in the sky. The sheer simplicity of the heartbreaking explanation, the heartbreaking purity of the innocent hope shining brightly in the young boy's eyes, hit Michael like a powerful physical punch to the gut. What kind of cruel man had he become for Julia to need to create such a heartbreaking story? What kind of man would he choose to be now in the face of this life-altering revelation? I'm sure you will, he managed to say in a barely trembling voice. Leo, honey. Julia appeared somewhat cautiously at the doorway, her emerald green eyes searching his. Time for lunch, sweetie. Go wash your hands. The little boy ran eagerly out of the room, leaving Michael and Julia completely alone in the small room filled with childhood aviation dreams. You told him that his dad is a pilot? Michael murmured softly, not as an accusation, but as a deeply painful observation. It seemed appropriate, she responded defensively, crossing her arms protectively across her chest. He's loved airplanes ever since he was a tiny baby. It must be in his blood. Julia, I don't. She interrupted him sharply, her voice low, but firm. Not here. Not now. We have a delicate lunch to somehow survive with your son and your beautiful girlfriend sitting at the exact same table. One drama at a time, Michael. She was absolutely right, as always. Julia had always been the sensible one, the one who always thought 3 steps ahead while he just reacted impulsively to any given situation. Lunch was served on the back porch overlooking the serene lake. The table was set with simple elegance. A crisp linen tablecloth, old china, and gleaming, polished silver cutlery. Carlos presided comfortably at the head of the long table with Leo sitting happily at his side. Julia sat protectively next to her son, while Michael and Isabel occupied the opposite side of the table. I sincerely hope you both like homemade food, Carlos commented warmly as a kind. Middle-aged woman served a steaming bowl of fragrant vegetable soup. Melia has been our loyal cook for over 30 years now. It's absolutely delicious, Michael commented sincerely after taking the first spoonful, surprising himself. When was the last time he had truly appreciated something as simple and genuine as homemade soup? So, Mr. Dawson, Carlos began the conversation after a few long minutes of awkward silence. How exactly did you two meet our Julia? Michael almost choked on his crusty bread, while Isabel raised her perfectly sculpted eyebrows, clearly interested in hearing the intriguing answer. We met at an aerospace engineering event, Julia responded quickly, glossing over the truth. Mr. Dawson was investing in a private airport project at the time. Ah, yes, Carlos smiled knowingly, clearly not entirely convinced by the half-truth. And now you've met again many years later. Destiny certainly has very curious ways of working. Do you actually believe in destiny? Isabel asked, eagerly trying to participate in the conversation. I strongly believe in consequences, the old man responded cryptically, his piercing eyes fixed intently on Michael's. Every single choice we consciously make creates invisible waves that will eventually return to our own shore, no matter how far or how desperately we swim to avoid them. The heavy silence that followed was interrupted only by the faint clinking of silverware against china and young Leo's occasional cheerful voice, completely oblivious to the intense tension that was hanging palpably in the air between the adults, animatedly recounting his eventful day at school. After dessert, a delicious homemade pumpkin pudding with cinnamon, which Michael was surprised to find himself thoroughly enjoying. Carlos suggested that they all rest for a little while before dinner. The sweets are ready, he said warmly. I imagine that you all must be tired from your long trip. Actually, Isabel said, rising gracefully from her chair, I'd really love to see a bit of the town. Michael, would you mind accompanying me? Before he could respond, Leo intervened enthusiastically. Can I show you the town? I know all the coolest places. The look of obvious panic that Michael shot at Julia was met with a slight, challenging smile. It would actually be very educational for Leo to serve as your personal guide, she commented casually. If you don't mind, of course. Michael began, looking helplessly at Isabel, who was clearly not at all enthusiastic about the entire idea. I'll go with you, Julia decided suddenly. There are some places that Leo doesn't know that well yet. We can show them the scenic lookout point and the historic church. The small excursion through the quiet rural town quickly became a strange, emotionally charged journey for Michael. Seeing young Leo running ahead, enthusiastically pointing out seemingly insignificant details that only an innocent child would even notice, with Julia walking silently and elegantly by his side, created a disturbing illusion of the idealized family life that had never actually existed for them. Isabel, carefully noticing the strange dynamic that was unfolding before her eyes, subtly distanced herself from the group, feigning interest in the colorful windows of the small craft shops. He's extraordinary, Michael commented in a low voice, watching Leo explain earnestly to a visibly uncomfortable Isabel how the old clocks in the ancient church tower actually worked. He is, Julia agreed quietly. In spite of you. The surprising harshness of her carefully chosen words contrasted sharply with the almost soothing softness of her voice. Julia, I didn't know. Would it have really made any difference? She interrupted him sharply, finally looking directly at him with those piercing emerald green eyes. If you had actually known that I was pregnant when you coldly decided to just leave that impersonal note and disappear completely from my life? The difficult question hung heavily between them, thick as the humid air before a torrential summer storm. Michael desperately wanted to say yes, that he never would have abandoned her if he had only known the truth. But the full truth was infinitely more complex and painful. Would the man that he had been 5 years ago have actually stayed and embraced his responsibilities? Or would he have simply offered financial support, while carefully maintaining the same calculated emotional distance that he had always so carefully cherished? I honestly don't know, he answered truthfully. I was a very different person back then. And who are you now, Michael? The question was almost a whisper. Are you still the same man who is about to ask his beautiful model to marry him? Or are you finally the man who just found out that he actually has a son? Before he could even answer, Leo came running back to them excitedly, holding something in his small hands. Look what I just found, Mommy. A wooden airplane. It's beautiful, honey. Julia smiled warmly, gently stroking her son's soft hair. Can I, Mommy? Please? The little boy looked hopefully up at her, having clearly discussed something with the kind craftsman at the small store. All right, but only for a moment. Leo turned excitedly to Michael, holding out the small wooden airplane. Do you want to hold it? The man at the store said it brings good luck when we give it to someone special to touch it first. The entire world seemed to stop for a brief moment as Michael carefully received the precious gift from the young boy's small hands. Something so simple, a handmade wooden toy, suddenly carried the immense weight of all the complicated choices he had made in his life, and all the incredibly important ones he still had to make in the future. It's very special, he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, Leo. In the distance, Isabel watched the strange, touching scene unfold before her, a calculating expression gradually replacing her initial discomfort. Night quickly fell over Case Moreau de Abreu with a comforting speed that was typical of small towns. Dinner at the guest house was served by candlelight in the serene garden under a breathtaking starry sky that Michael could barely even remember when he had last truly appreciated. After dinner, while Leo was being put to bed, the adults congregated in the living room. Carlos began pouring a honey-colored liquor into delicate crystal glasses. Homemade cachaça, he announced proudly. Aged in oak barrels for 20 years. It's just the thing for difficult conversations. Isabel glanced at her watch, a subtly elegant but obviously expensive piece. I think I'll turn in, she declared, giving Michael a knowing look. It's been quite the day. Once she had left the room, Carlos also rose to his feet. I believe you two have a great deal to discuss, he said, his knowing gaze moving between Michael and Julia. Just remember, some structures, once broken, can never be rebuilt exactly as they were. But sometimes what is built in their place is stronger, more real. With these cryptic words, the old man excused himself, leaving them alone in the thick silence with the heady aroma of the cachaça. Why now? Michael finally asked, breaking the stillness. After 5 years? Julia swirled the amber liquid in her glass, watching the candlelight dance across the crystal facets. It wasn't my idea, she admitted. But when the opportunity presented itself, I couldn't refuse. What opportunity? Your mother. Julia met his gaze, the revelation hanging between them like a palpable thing. She found me 6 months ago. Michael felt his blood turn to ice. My mother? How? Private investigators. Apparently, she always suspected that you might have a child somewhere. She said you followed a predictable pattern. Intense involvement followed by abrupt flight when things got emotionally deep. The description of his behavior struck him with its accuracy. It mirrored exactly what he had done with Julia, and with others before her. And Isabel, is she also part of this plan? Julia's smile was sad, almost pitying. Your girlfriend is Amanda Vidal, a private investigator hired by your mother over a year ago. She's not an international model, Michael. She has a law degree and specializes in locating people and building behavioral profiles. The shock of the revelation felt like a physical blow. Michael rose abruptly, his mind reeling from the implications. 2 years of a relationship, all the intimate moments, the confidences exchanged, all part of an elaborate deception. "I don't believe it," he murmured, though deep down, he knew it was true. It explained the cryptic message, the calculated serenity of Isabel, or rather, Amanda, in the face of the day's bizarre events. "Why would my mother do this?" he asked, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Julia responded softly, "That's something you'll have to ask her. She'll be here tomorrow." The sunrise in Case Moreau de Arau brought with it a symphony of sounds Michael had almost forgotten existed. The cheerful chirping of birds, the gentle rustling of wind through the leaves, the distant lowing of cattle from neighboring farms. Seated on the guesthouse porch, cradling a mug of strong coffee, the businessman watched the first rays of sunlight paint the lake a shimmering gold as his mind struggled to process the previous night's revelations. Isabel, or rather, Amanda, was gone from her room when he returned. His first impulse was to call his lawyer, to initiate some kind of legal action against this egregious invasion of privacy, this elaborate manipulation. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the aged Cachesa, perhaps Julia's sincere gaze, or perhaps, just perhaps, it was the weight of a responsibility that was beginning to take shape in his consciousness. "You were always an early riser." His mother's voice startled him, almost causing him to spill his coffee. Catherine Dawson, even at 60, maintained the understated elegance and impeccable posture that had always defined her, dressed with a simple grace that still radiated sophistication. She sat in the chair next to her son. Her eyes, the same dark brown eyes he had inherited, studying him with that familiar intensity. "Mother," Michael managed to say, surprise giving way to confusion and then to a surge of irritation. "You have a lot of explaining to do." "I do," she agreed calmly, pouring herself coffee from the thermos on the rustic table. "Just as you do." And the silence stretched between them for a long moment, filled only by the sounds of the awakening countryside. Michael struggled to collect his thoughts, to formulate the right questions, to understand how his own mother, the woman who had always respected his space, his decisions, his independence, had orchestrated such an elaborate intervention in his life. "Why?" was all he could finally manage to ask. Catherine took a deep breath, her eyes lost in the landscape for a moment before returning to her son. "Because you are becoming your father?" she responded with a softness that did nothing to diminish the impact of the words. "And I promised myself when I first held you that I would do everything in my power to prevent that from happening." The mention of his father caused Michael to stiffen. Arthur Dawson had been a ruthless businessman, building an empire at the expense of destroyed relationships, including his marriage and his relationship with his son. He had died alone in his lavish penthouse, surrounded by wealth but devoid of genuine connection. "I'm not like him," Michael protested, his voice low but firm. "No?" Catherine raised an eyebrow. "How many relationships have you ended at the first sign of emotional intimacy? How many times have you abandoned people who cared about you because it was easier than confronting your own vulnerability? Your father did the exact same thing, Michael. The difference is he had me to clean up the mess." The words struck Michael like precisely thrown stones, each one finding a truth he had spent years denying. "And who cleaned up my mess?" he asked, dreading the answer. "No one," Catherine responded simply. "Julia refused any contact, any help. When I finally found out about Leo, through investigators I hired out of purely maternal instinct, she had already rebuilt her life here." "How? How is she now?" The question slipped out before Michael could stop it. A small smile played on Catherine's lips. "Extraordinary. She used her engineering background to specialize in aviation. She works for 3 different companies, flying to international destinations. She raised a son alone. She built an impeccable reputation and still made time to be an active part of this community." The pride in his mother's voice when she spoke of Julia was unmistakable, and Michael felt a pang of jealousy, not of the admiration for Julia, but of the strength of character that he himself had never been able to summon. "And now," he asked, placing the empty mug on the table, "what do you expect to happen? That I abandon my life? my businesses, and move to this small town to play happy family? The look Catherine gave her son was a mixture of disappointment and stubborn hope. I expect that you, for the first time in your life, face the consequences of your choices instead of running from them. That you get to know your son, not because you have to, but because he deserves to be known. And maybe, just maybe, that you learn there are things in this life more valuable than corporate mergers and quarterly profits. Before Michael could respond, the sound of children's footsteps interrupted their conversation. Leo appeared on the porch, still in his pajamas, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Good morning," he murmured, then froze when he saw Catherine. His eyes widened, the sleepiness instantly replaced by a vibrant curiosity. "You're the lady from the portrait." Catherine smiled, genuinely surprised. "Portrait? In Grandpa Carlos's office," Leo explained, approaching cautiously. "There's a picture of you with him from a long time ago. Grandpa said you were a great friend of the family." Michael looked at his mother, confused. Catherine seemed equally surprised by the mention of the portrait, but quickly regained her composure. "Yes, I met your grandfather many years ago," she confirmed. "Even before you were born." Leo studied Catherine with an almost comical intensity. His small brow furrowed in concentration. "You look like him," he declared finally, pointing to Michael. "That's my mother," Michael explained. The words sounded strange even to his own ears. "So that makes her your grandmother?" Leo's eyes lit up with realization. "You're my grandma?" Catherine shot a quick glance at Michael before nodding. "Yes, honey, I am your grandma." What happened next took Michael completely by surprise. Leo threw himself into Catherine's arms with unrestrained joy, hugging her as if he had found a long-lost treasure. "I have a grandma!" he exclaimed, the pure delight in his voice causing something to crack inside Michael's chest. "Wait until I tell Peter at school. He has 3 grandmas. But his grandma isn't as pretty as you." Catherine laughed, hugging her grandson with a naturalness that made Michael realize this was not their first meeting. The thought should have angered him, another manipulation, another secret, but instead, he felt only a profound sadness for the moments he had missed. The first words, the first steps, the first smiles he had never witnessed. "Have you had breakfast yet, champ?" Catherine asked, pulling back just enough to look at her grandson's animated face. "Not yet," Leo replied. "Mommy said I can have hot chocolate today because it's a special day." "And what special day is this?" Michael couldn't help but ask. Leo looked at him as if the answer were obvious. "Important visitor day. Grandpa Carlos said people who come from far away deserve hot chocolate." The simplicity of the child's logic brought an involuntary smile to Michael's face. There was something refreshing about the way children perceived the world, unburdened by the layers of complication that adults invariably added to everything. "Leo, honey," Julia's voice called from the porch doorway. "Don't bother the guests so early." "I'm not bothering them," the boy protested. "I'm meeting my grandma." Julia froze, her eyes meeting Catherine's in a silent exchange that Michael couldn't decipher. There was history there, deeper than he had initially imagined. "Good morning, Catherine," Julia finally said, approaching. "I didn't realize you would arrive so early." "The first flight," Catherine responded simply. "Carlos picked me up at the airport." Another piece of the puzzle. Carlos, Julia's grandfather, was clearly implicated in this family conspiracy. The more Michael discovered, the more he realized how elaborate the web woven around him had become. "Leo, go get dressed for breakfast," Julia instructed gently. "Then you can show Catherine your new airport model." The boy nodded enthusiastically before running inside, leaving the 3 adults in a silence thick with unresolved tension. "How long have you known my mother, exactly?" Michael finally asked Julia. "Personally, for 6 months," she responded, sitting at the table. "But through letters, almost 3 years. "Letters?" Michael looked at Catherine incredulously. "In the digital age?" His mother shrugged elegantly. "Some conversations are too sacred for emails that can be hacked or messages that can be spied on. And there's something about handwriting that compels sincerity. Don't you think?" Before Michael could fully process this new information, Amanda, the fake Isabel, appeared on the porch, dressed in practical clothes that contrasted sharply with the sophisticated style she had cultivated during her 2-year relationship with Michael. "Good morning, everyone," she greeted, her accent subtly different from what Michael was accustomed to. "I imagine it's time for us to drop the charade." Michael stood up abruptly. 2 years, Amanda. 2 years of lies. "I prefer to think of it as 2 years of in-depth research," she responded calmly. "And believe me, Michael, I learned far more about you than I ever needed to reveal to your mother." "Why?" The question was directed at everyone and no one in particular. "Why this elaborate theater? Why not just tell me about Leo?" "We tried," Julia responded softly. "In the first few months after I found out I was pregnant, I sent dozens of emails, left countless messages, all blocked, all ignored. And when I finally located you," Catherine continued, "you were so immersed in your world of business, so convinced of your own narrative, that any mention of past responsibilities was immediately dismissed. We needed you to see," Amanda added. "Not just hear about it, not just know about it intellectually, but see your son, feel his reality, understand what you were missing before it was too late." Michael sank back into his chair, stunned by the brutal honesty of these 3 women, who, each in their own way, had conspired to confront him with the truth he had spent years evading. "And what happens now?" he asked, his voice more vulnerable than he had ever allowed in public. "That," Julia responded, "depends entirely on you. Not on the Dawson Empire, not on the impeccable CEO, not on the man who built skyscrapers and exclusive resorts. It depends on Michael, the man, the father, the person you choose to be from today onward." The silence that followed was broken by the arrival of Carlos, carrying a tray laden with homemade cakes and more fresh coffee. The old man surveyed the scene with shrewd eyes before offering a warm smile. "I see the formal introductions have been made," he commented casually. "Excellent. I hate secrets at breakfast. They hinder digestion." The comment, so mundane amidst the emotional intensity of the moment, provoked a few reluctant chuckles around the table, briefly easing the tension. "Catherine," Carlos continued, taking his place at the head of the table, "Leo is eager to show you his collection. I believe he inherited his grandfather's technical eye." The casual mention of the relationship caused Michael to look up, the pieces falling into place. "You were a pilot," he recalled, connecting the dots. "In the photos in the hallway." Carlos nodded. "A 42-year career. I started in small cargo planes and ended up commanding Boeing 747s for Varig. The passion for flying has been in the family for 3 generations now." "4," Catherine corrected softly. Michael's father was also fascinated by aviation, although he never pursued it as a career. Another unexpected revelation. Michael looked at his mother, confused. Dad rarely talked about anything he couldn't completely control. Catherine responded, "And the sky, Michael? The sky can never be truly controlled. It can only be respected, understood, navigated with humility." The analogy was not lost on him. Michael glimpsed, for the first time, the possibility that his life, so carefully planned, so rigidly controlled, might be missing precisely what would make it meaningful. The ability to adapt to the unexpected, to navigate the uncontrollable, to find beauty in unpredictability. Leo returned at that moment, now fully dressed and bursting with energy. "Grandma, are you coming to see my collection now? It has a plane just like the one Mr. Michael came in. It's a Gulfstream G150. Michael looked at his son, with a new perspective. This small being, whom he had not helped raise, whom he had not known until yesterday, already possessed knowledge about aviation that many adults lacked. The technical precision, the attention to detail, the passion for knowledge were traits he recognized in himself, though directed toward different fields. "Why don't we all go?" he suggested, surprising himself. "I'd like to see your collection too, Leo." And the smile that lit up the boy's face was like a ray of sunshine piercing heavy clouds. Bright, unexpected, transformative. For a fleeting moment, Michael glimpsed what could have been, and perhaps what could still be. As they followed Leo down the guesthouse hallway, Julia approached Michael, her voice low enough for only him to hear. "He has your smile," she commented. "And your stubbornness." There was no bitterness in her words, just a simple statement of undeniable biological fact. Michael nodded, unable to find words adequate for the moment. The visit to Leo's room quickly evolved into an impromptu lesson on aviation, with the boy demonstrating surprising expertise for his age. With each enthusiastic explanation, each meticulous demonstration, Michael felt something unfamiliar stirring within his chest. A mixture of pride, admiration, and profound regret for the lost years. The hours stretched into days as the purported technical failure of the jet conveniently persisted. Michael discovered that his phone mysteriously struggled to maintain an adequate signal for video conferences, limiting him to brief emails and text messages to his team. The Dawson Empire would continue to function without his constant presence, a realization that was both liberating and unsettling for a man who had always considered himself indispensable. On the afternoon of the third day, Michael found himself sitting by the lake, watching Leo feed the ducks with scraps of stale bread. Beside the boy, Catherine was laughing at something he had said, her eyes sparkling with a joy that Michael had rarely witnessed. "He's completely won over my mother," he observed when Julia approached, carrying a tray with glasses of fresh lemonade. "Leo has that effect on people," she responded, settling onto the rustic bench next to him. "It's as if he can see right through the layers we've built up over the years." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on his son, still feeling strange to think of him that way, chasing after a particularly bold duck that was attempting to snatch the bread directly from his hand. "Does he know?" he finally asked, voicing the question that had been consuming him for days. "About me, I mean." Julia took a sip of lemonade, her gaze steady on the scene unfolding before them. "He knows that his dad is someone who couldn't be present, who works far away, who one day might be able to be a part of his life." "Gentle lies," Michael murmured. "Adapted truths," Julia corrected. "Leo is still too young to understand abandonment or rejection. When he's older, if you decide to be a part of his life, he'll understand that people make mistakes, learn, and grow." "And what if I don't make that choice?" The question slipped out before he could restrain it. Julia turned to face him, her green eyes studying him intently. "Then I will continue to raise our son to be a better man than his father. A man who faces his responsibilities instead of running from them." The starkness of her words contrasted with the gentleness of her voice, making them all the more impactful. Michael realized that, despite everything, Julia didn't hate him. She simply saw him with unwavering clarity, without the illusions he had cultivated about himself for so long. "Why aviation?" he asked, changing the subject. "Of all the careers you could have pursued with your brilliance, why did you choose one that keeps you constantly on the move?" A faint smile touched her lips. "Perhaps because in the sky, Michael, there's no way to feign absolute control. You can have the best training, the most advanced aircraft, the most meticulous planning, but you will still be at the mercy of elements you cannot master. The wind, the air currents, sudden shifts in the weather. And that's liberating for you?" "It's honest," she responded simply. "And after years of living under an illusion of security by your side, I've discovered that I prefer the honesty of uncertainty 1,000 times over the false security of empty promises." Michael felt the impact of her words like a physical blow. It was true. He had constructed relationships built on implied promises he never intended to fulfill, on expectations he had fueled without ever considering their emotional toll on others. Before he could respond, Leo came running toward them, his face glowing with a radiant smile. "Look what I found!" he exclaimed, opening his small hands to reveal a tiny turtle. "Grandpa Carlos said it's a baby tiger turtle. Can we build a little house for it in the lake?" Michael glanced at Julia, unsure how to respond. She gave a subtle nod, granting him silent permission to participate in this moment. "I think the little turtle already has a house," he replied, surprised by the naturalness of his tone. "The whole lake is its home. If we take it somewhere else, it might miss its family." Leo's face clouded with seriousness as he considered the words. "Just like you missed your family when you went to work far away?" The innocent question struck Michael with unexpected force. How to explain to a child that he had deliberately chosen distance over connection. That working far away was a fabricated story to soften a far more painful truth. Sometimes, he responded carefully, adults make mistakes. They think they're doing the right thing, but then they realize they've lost important things along the way. Leo scrutinized his face with surprising intensity for such a young child. Like what? Like meeting wonderful people? Like me? Michael responded honestly. The smile returned to the boy's face. You can visit whenever you want. We have a guest room, and Grandpa Carlos makes pancakes on Sundays. The sheer simplicity of the offer, the unreserved generosity, caused something to shatter within Michael's chest. How could this small being, who had never received anything from him, so freely offer what he possessed? Thank you, Leo, he managed to say, gently stroking the boy's hair. That's very kind of you. After carefully releasing the turtle back into the water, Leo ran back to Catherine, who was waiting for him with a mysterious package that looked suspiciously like an airplane model kit. He's extraordinary, Michael commented, watching his son walk away. He is, Julia agreed. In spite of everything. The ensuing silence was interrupted by the arrival of Amanda, now dressed in practical attire that contrasted starkly with the elaborate wardrobe she had maintained as Isabel. News has arrived from Rio, she announced, taking a seat beside them. The parts for the plane have finally been located. They'll be here tomorrow afternoon. Michael raised an eyebrow. Have you finally decided to bring an end to our little family intervention? Amanda offered a humorless smile. My job is done, Michael. What you do with the information you've gathered is entirely your choice. And what choice is that, exactly? He asked, irritation creeping into his voice. Abandon the life I've built to become a weekend dad, or simply sign generous child support checks and carry on as if nothing happened. Julia rose abruptly. This is a conversation I'd rather not witness. Please excuse me. As she turned to leave, Amanda followed her with a thoughtful gaze before turning back to Michael. Do you know what the most difficult part of my job has been for the past 2 years? She asked rhetorically. It wasn't pretending to be interested in your endless business stories or attending tedious corporate events. It was witnessing an intelligent and capable man living a completely empty life without even realizing it. Empty, Michael repeated, indignant. I've built an empire that employs thousands of people. I've transformed entire neighborhoods. I've revolutionized the country's luxury real estate market. And when you return to your $50 million penthouse at night, who is there to hear about your day? Amanda asked softly. When you receive an award, who genuinely celebrates your success? When you fall ill, who holds your hand? The questions hung in the air between them, uncomfortably precise. Michael averted his gaze, unable to sustain the intensity in Amanda's eyes. Your mother didn't do this out of malice, Michael, she continued. She did it out of love, because she watched her own husband walk the same path and end up alone, despite all his wealth and power. What do you know about my father? Michael asked defensively. I know he also had a son he didn't acknowledge, Amanda replied calmly. A son who grew up without knowing his true origins until a rare genetic disease brought the truth to light. Michael felt his blood run cold. What are you talking about? Ask your mother. Amanda stood up. Some stories are not mine to tell. She walked away, leaving Michael with more questions than answers, a pattern that seemed to define his days in that small town. That night, the guest house hosted a special dinner in the garden, where colorful lanterns hung from the trees, casting a warm glow. A long table, draped with a pristine white linen tablecloth, was the centerpiece, adorned with wildflowers arranged in charming, rustic vases. The meal, simple yet incredibly delicious, was served on handcrafted ceramic platters, complemented by the rich flavors of red wine from a nearby winery. Leo, allowed to stay up well past his usual bedtime, joined the adults at the table, though as the evening progressed, his energy clearly started to wane. Eventually, he drifted off to sleep in Julia's lap, and she continued to engage in the conversation, gently stroking her son's hair. It's time to put him to bed, she murmured. carefully attempting to stand up without disturbing the sleeping boy. "Can I help?" Michael offered, almost without thinking. Julia paused for a moment, considering, before finally nodding her assent. With utmost care, Michael lifted Leo into his arms, surprised by the unexpected weight of the small body. It was a comforting weight, one that seemed to fill a void in his chest he hadn't even realized existed. Following Julia down the hallway, he entered Leo's room, which had become familiar to him over the past few days, thanks to countless visits to admire the boy's airplane collection and listen to endless stories about famous pilots and extraordinary aircraft. With a tenderness he never knew he possessed, Michael gently laid Leo on the cockpit-shaped bed. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake up as Julia carefully removed his shoes and covered him with a comforter adorned with clouds and planes. "Does he always sleep like this?" Michael asked in a hushed voice. "So peacefully?" "Most nights," Julia replied, adjusting the pillow beneath Leo's head. "Except when there are thunderstorms. He's afraid of thunder." Another detail about his son, one that Michael would never have known if it weren't for this elaborate intervention. How many others were there? First tooth, first word, first step. Milestones he had irrevocably missed. Why are you letting me into his life now? He wondered, as they left the room, leaving the door ajar as Julia had instructed. After 5 years of keeping him away, Julia leaned against the hallway wall, her eyes studying him with that familiar intensity that always made him feel uncomfortably exposed. "Because Leo is starting to ask questions I can no longer answer with stories about pilots on international routes," she responded honestly. "Because he deserves the chance to know his complete story, even if that includes a father who chose not to be a part of his life." "And what if I want to be a part of it now?" The words slipped out before Michael could fully consider them. "That would depend entirely on your terms, Michael," Julia responded, crossing her arms defensively. "Leo is not a weekend project or a social obligation to impress investors. He is a complete person with emotional needs, with expectations, with a heart that can be easily broken." "I wouldn't do that," Michael protested. "You already did," Julia responded simply. "With me, with others before me. I imagine it's a pattern, Michael. One that your mother recognized because she lived with your father. The question is, are you willing to break this cycle, truly? Or just reacting emotionally to a situation that will soon seem less urgent when you're back in your world of skyscrapers and offshore bank accounts?" The brutal frankness of her words struck Michael like a splash of cold water, shocking him into a stark awareness of truths he had spent his entire adult life avoiding. "I don't know," he admitted finally. The honesty was painful but necessary. "I want to believe I am. I want to be better than my father was, but I don't know if I know how." Julia's face softened slightly at this unexpected display of vulnerability. "No one is born knowing how to be a father, Michael. It's a skill you learn daily through trial and error. The difference is that some choose to learn, while others run away at the first sign of difficulty." Michael nodded, finally understanding the magnitude of the choice before him. It wasn't just about legally acknowledging Leo or providing financial support. It was about committing to a journey of personal growth that would demand more courage from him than any business negotiation ever had. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the guest room window, gently rousing Michael from a surprisingly deep sleep. For a moment, he felt disoriented, so used to the panoramic views of skyscrapers that his penthouse in Sao Paulo offered. Instead, his eyes met the sight of a clear blue sky, distant mountains, and the shimmering gold of the lake visible through the window. A week had passed since his unexpected arrival in Case Moreau de Abreu, a week that felt both fleeting and like an eternity. The technical issue that had grounded his jet had finally been resolved, and today was the day he was scheduled to leave, or to choose to stay in some capacity. He rose and walked to the window. In the garden below, Leo was playing with a small glider plane, running and launching it into the air, again and again, adjusting the angle with each attempt, intuitively learning about aerodynamics through play. Julia was watching him closely, a smile gracing her lips as she sipped her morning coffee. Michael felt a sharp pang in his chest, not of pain, but of recognition. The scene playing out below was a glimpse of a life he had never lived, a possibility he had discarded without ever truly understanding its worth. His phone vibrated on the bedside table. The signal, miraculously restored the night before, had brought a flood of emails, messages, and notifications. His empire was calling him back. One notification in particular caught his eye. Dawson and Corporation's shares had dropped by 3%. So, the rumors about an unacknowledged heir of the CEO had already leaked, probably thanks to some observant employee at the airport who had recognized the famous businessman boarding with the international model and disembarking in a small town with a pilot and a child who was his spitting image. Another email, this one from his financial director, warned of an urgent board meeting needed to manage the damage to the company's reputation. Michael almost laughed at the irony. His entire adult life had been dedicated to cultivating an impeccable reputation, and now the mere existence of his own son was considered damage to be controlled. He dressed slowly, each movement deliberate, as if he were making a critical decision with every button he fastened, every item of clothing he chose. When he finally went downstairs for breakfast, he found the family gathered in the garden. Not just Julia and Leo, but also Carlos, Catherine, and, surprisingly, Amanda, who was still present despite her mission technically being complete. "Good morning," he greeted them, feeling strangely nervous, as if he were about to deliver a crucial presentation to investors instead of simply having coffee with people who, in different ways, were now his family. "Michael," Leo waved excitedly. "Look how far my plane can fly now." The boy launched the small glider, and this time it traced a graceful arc through the air before landing gently on the grass several feet away. "Impressive," Michael commented genuinely, as he sat down at the table. "Did you adjust the angle of the wings?" Leo nodded enthusiastically. "Grandpa Carlos showed me how. It's all about aerodynamics." "Leo has an intuitive understanding of physics that is truly remarkable for his age," Julia commented, passing Michael a cup of coffee. "His science teacher says he asks questions that many adults wouldn't think to ask." The pride in her voice was undeniable, as was the unspoken implication. Asterisk, you missed all of this. 5 years of achievements, discoveries, firsts. "I imagine you're anxious to return to civilization," Carlos commented, peering at him over his reading glasses. The local newspaper spread open in front of him. "The jet has been ready since last night." "Actually," Michael began, surprising even himself with the words that followed, "I was thinking of staying a few more days if it's not inconvenient." The silence that followed was telling. Julia looked up from her cup, visibly surprised. Catherine smiled softly, as if she had foreseen this moment. Leo, oblivious to the adult complexities, simply celebrated. "Yes, we can go to the Aviation Museum in MA. There's a real Spitfire there." "That would be acceptable," Julia responded cautiously, her eyes studying Michael with a newly awakened wariness. "I have some virtual meetings that I can't postpone," Michael explained, "but they can be done from here, and I'd like to get to know Leo's routine better." That afternoon, while Leo was at school, Michael finally had the conversation he had been avoiding with his mother. Sitting by the lake, away from prying ears, Catherine confirmed what Amanda had hinted at. "Your father had another son, 3 years older than you," she revealed calmly, "with a company secretary before we met. When she got pregnant, he fired her and denied any responsibility." "And how did you find out?" Michael asked, feeling a strange mixture of shock and inexplicable relief, as if a mystery he hadn't even known existed was finally making sense. "When you were 12, we got a call from the hospital. A 15-year-old boy urgently needed a bone marrow transplant. He had a rare genetic condition that also appears in your father's family. The doctors had traced possible compatible donors. And he was my brother, Rodrigo." Michael supplied the name softly. "Yes," she confirmed. "Your father denied it to the end. Even when the tests confirmed it, he refused to help. He forbade you from being tested as a potential donor." Michael closed his eyes, trying to process the magnitude of this revelation. "And what happened to him?" "He found another, less compatible donor. He survived, but with complications. He lives in Canada now. He's a university professor of engineering." "Did you keep in touch?" Discreetly. Your father never knew. Rodrigo contacted me when he was 20, wanting to know his story. He wasn't angry, just curious. He's an extraordinary man, Michael. You would like him. Michael felt as if the ground were giving way beneath his feet. His entire life, he had believed he was an only child, raised by an emotionally distant but at least physically present father. Now he discovered that he was part of a pattern, a cycle of abandonment he was perilously close to repeating. "Why are you telling me this now?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Because you are at the same crossroads your father was. Twice he chose the path of least emotional involvement, with Rodrigo and then with you in his own way. The question is, which choice will you make, Michael?" That night, after helping Leo with his homework, a surprisingly rewarding experience, Michael found Julia alone on the porch, watching the stars. Without preamble, he said, "I want to be a part of his life. I don't know how. I don't know if I'll be good at it, but I want to try." Julia continued to gaze at the sky for a long moment before responding. "It's not a simple decision, Michael. It's not just about occasional visits or expensive birthday presents. It's about consistency, commitment, being present even when it's inconvenient." "I know," he responded, stepping closer to look at the same sky she was contemplating. "I'm willing to learn, to change what's necessary." "Why?" The question was simple but loaded with meaning. Why now, after 5 years? Michael considered several answers, some calculated to impress her, others to elicit sympathy. But in the end, he chose the simple, raw truth. "Because when I look at Leo, I see the person I could have been if I had learned early that connection is more important than control. And because I don't want him to grow up thinking he wasn't important enough for me to change." Something in Julia's face softened, almost imperceptibly. "It won't be easy for any of us. The things that truly matter rarely are," she responded, surprising herself with a wisdom she never knew she possessed. In the days that followed, Michael began the delicate process of integrating himself into Leo's life without disrupting the stability Julia had so carefully built. He participated in an open house at school, where Leo proudly introduced him as a family friend who builds huge buildings. He accompanied him to swimming practice, discovering that the boy had inherited not only his aptitude for numbers but also his competitive spirit. Each new detail about his son was a treasure, from the way he wrinkled his nose when he was concentrating to his inexplicable aversion to peas, or how he would hum softly while he drew. In video conferences with his executive team, Michael surprised everyone by announcing a 3-month partial leave of absence. He delegated responsibilities, reorganized projects, and, for the first time in his career, prioritized something above business. "The board is not happy," he commented to Amanda during one of the rare moments they spoke alone. "They think I'm having some kind of midlife crisis." "And are you?" she asked. Her investigative instincts, it seemed, had never completely left her. "I'm having an identity crisis," he corrected, with an ironic smile. "I'm discovering that the man I thought I was my entire adult life is only a fraction of the man I can be." On the morning of the 15th day in Case Moreau de Abreu, while having coffee on the now familiar porch, Leo asked the question everyone knew would eventually come. "You're my dad, aren't you?" The silence that followed was absolute. Julia froze, her cup halfway to her lips. Catherine and Carlos exchanged worried glances. Amanda discreetly got up and walked away, giving them privacy. Michael felt his heart race, but he kept his eyes fixed on the boy's eyes, so similar to his own, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and a wisdom beyond his years. "Yes," he responded simply. "I am your dad." Leo nodded, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Why didn't you live with us?" The question, so direct and impossible to evade, demanded equal honesty. Michael glanced briefly at Julia, who nodded slightly, giving him permission to navigate these delicate waters. "Because I made a mistake," he responded, carefully choosing his words. "A big mistake. When your mother and I met, I didn't know how to be the person she and you deserved. So instead of learning, I ran away." "Like a coward?" Leo asked, the innocence of childhood giving him a frankness no adult would dare. Michael felt the sting of the word, but he didn't look away. Yes, like a coward. But I'm trying to be braver now. Leo considered this for a moment. His small brow furrowed in concentration. Grandpa Carlos says that being brave isn't not being afraid. It's doing the right thing even when you're afraid. Your grandpa is a wise man, Michael responded, feeling an unexpected surge of gratitude for the old man who had helped raise his son in his absence. Are you going to live with us now? The next question made all the adults hold their breath. No, honey, Julia intervened gently. But your dad wants to be a part of your life in a different way. How? Leo insisted, looking back and forth between the two of them. Michael took a deep breath before responding. I want to get to know you, Leo. Learn about your planes, your friends, your favorite stories. I want to be there for your games and school presentations. I can't change the past, but we can build a future together if you want. Leo considered the proposal with a seriousness that was surprising for someone so young. Finally, he extended his small hand toward Michael. We have a deal, then, but you have to promise never to be a coward again. Michael took the small hand offered, feeling the enormous weight of the promise he was about to make. I promise to try every day, he responded, knowing it was the only honest promise he could offer. 3 months later, Michael watched from the co-pilot seat as Julia piloted the small Cessna over the Green Mountains. In the back seat, Leo pointed enthusiastically at cloud formations and details of the landscape below, his animated voice amplified by the headset. Much had changed since that first interrupted flight. Michael had kept his word, reorganizing his life to include regular visits to Case Moreau de Abreu. He had rented a house in the city for the weekends, learned to cook Leo's favorite dishes, albeit poorly, and had even started taking flying lessons, not to compete with Julia, but to better understand the world that so fascinated his son. Dawson Corporations had weathered the initial scandal, and after a press conference where Michael publicly acknowledged Leo's paternity, the shares had stabilized. Some conservative investors had left, but others, surprisingly, saw the transparency as a positive sign of corporate maturity. Look, Dad. Leo's voice in the headset still caused a wave of emotion in Michael every time he used that word, a title he was slowly learning to earn. That's our lake down there. I see it, he responded, smiling at his son's enthusiasm. It looks even more beautiful from above. Everything looks different when you change your perspective, Julia commented, gently adjusting the controls. Ready to take over for a minute? The offer surprised Michael. Are you sure? We're at cruising altitude, clear sky, perfect conditions, she responded, that slight smile he was beginning to recognize again curving her lips. Besides, I have good reflexes if you start taking us toward a mountain. With care, Michael placed his hands on the controls, feeling the subtle vibration of the aircraft, the literal responsibility for 3 lives in his hands. It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Are you flying, Dad? Leo exclaimed, pride evident in his voice. I am, Michael confirmed, concentrating intently on keeping the plane level. I am flying. But somehow those simple words carried a much deeper meaning, not just about controlling an aircraft, but about finally taking control of his own life, his choices, his responsibilities. The open sky in front of him, infinite in its possibilities, seemed the perfect setting for this moment of clarity. Michael Dawson, who had spent his life building structures that touched the sky, was finally learning to fly. Not alone, as he had always believed was more efficient, but accompanied, guided, supported by people who, in different ways, formed the family he never knew he needed. Where are we going now? Leo asked, his voice full of expectation. Michael exchanged a look with Julia before responding, finding in her eyes not the love they had once shared, but something equally valuable. Respect, mutual understanding, and the silent promise of a future where they would both put their son's needs above all else. Wherever you want, Michael responded, meaning so much more than just the flight's destination.